Ok, cuando quieras tú me dices.
Adelante.
El evento lo presenta Fundación Libertad, ¿verdad?
Sí, Internacional para la Libertad. Cuando quieras.
Well, good morning, everybody. Today, Fundación Libertad is presenting a particularly relevant and useful report on Europe's relationship with Venezuela. The report was prepared by Mr. Ryan Berg, who's a senior fellow in the Americas program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and he's also an adjunct professor at the Catholic University of America and a visiting research fellow at the University of Oxford's Changing Character of War program. He is joined by Mr. Jorge González-Gallarza, who's a researcher at the Fundación Civismo in Madrid and the co-host of the Uncommon Decency podcast on Europe. The paper, I think, comes at a particularly important moment because the situation in Venezuela couldn't get worse. The situation in Europe is getting worse regarding the relationship with the US, the state of democracy, and the problem of illegal migrations into Europe. And with the US, we have a very interesting situation. I mean, for the first time in the last 4 years, there is a normal, so to say, relationship between the US and Europe. And I think Europe should take advantage of that situation. And we have an American administration that is particularly confused, not only in relationship with its international position, but particularly in the Venezuelan case. The US has tried all means to try and help the return to democracy of Venezuela, but hasn't been successful so far. Now that both the illegal government in Venezuela and the so-called government provisional outside of Venezuela seem to have no solution to the Venezuelan problem, the US has been pushing for some sort of understanding or dialogue between both parties. That has proved to be difficult. So the European intervention, and particularly the European one, could come in very helpful at this time. The relationship between Latin America and Europe, and particularly Latin America, Hispanic America, and Spain, has been very rich. Since the second half of the 19th century until the end of the 20th century, migration from Spain to Latin America or Hispanic America or Spanish America was very substantial. And the remittances from those countries, particularly countries like Argentina, Venezuela, Mexico, to Spain were very substantial. The cooperation of countries like Venezuela and Mexico to the return of democracy in Spain was very substantial too. So, as I understand it, there is a big compromise and debt from Spain to Latin America. I mean, this is a good time to show some sort of thankfulness or intelligence, I would say, too, because as you will see from the report, the situation in Venezuela represents a threat to Europe. So I'll leave Mr. Berg and Mr. González-Gallarza with you to explain their very interesting paper, which I suggest that you read after this talk. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Marcel, for that excellent introduction. I'm going to first just thank both you, Marcel, and Jorge for being here, and also for the Fundación Internacional para la Libertad for putting on this event. In terms of my remarks, I'm just going to talk about a little bit about the history here, provide viewers with an understanding of what's going on in Venezuela to give a sort of scene setter for the situation. And then I think Jorge is going to talk about the security threat that Venezuela poses to the European Union and why that's been sort of significantly underestimated over the years. So the first thing I want to say is that I think it's very difficult to overestimate the humanitarian challenges and security challenges that have been provoked by the breakdown of the Venezuelan state under the leadership of the criminal Maduro regime. As Venezuela's public services have deteriorated, we've seen refugee flows to neighboring Colombia, and those remain unabated. So far, about 5.5 million people have departed from Venezuela, representing the second largest migratory flow anywhere in the world, and a flow that's on pace to pass Syria's flow during their civil war quite soon. While Venezuelan refugees are present in all countries across South America, the United States, and indeed in Europe, some walking the equivalent of the distance between New York City and Phoenix, or to put it in the European context, Madrid and Kiev, in search of a new home, most have remained in Colombia. So somewhere between 1.7 and 1.9 million Venezuelan refugees now make their home in Colombia. And the United Nations estimates that by the end of 2021, this number could increase by another 2.4 million. There are, in addition to that, a number of what we call pendular migrants, people who cross the border on a daily basis for sundry reasons. And they comprise another 2 million people. It might be they cross for basic food, clean water, to grab remittances, to get medicines that are unavailable in Venezuela, but they're pendular. They come and they go. At the height of Venezuela's migration, there were about 5 million people leaving the country on a day-to-day basis. Now we've seen those numbers down to about 2,000 people per day. So 5,000 people per day at the height, now about 2,000. The practical collapse of Venezuela, which used to be the region's wealthiest country, has exposed this population to a considerable range of hardships, stressors, traumas. The arrival of COVID-19 as the sort of overlay for this entire situation really exacerbates these trends. We don't have a good sense of how many cases of COVID there are in Venezuela. The Maduro regime controls information and the information space very tightly, and testing is conducted mostly in Caracas only, but it is far more than being reported. There are no vaccines. There are only about 1 to 1.5 million vaccines that have been accounted for, which translates into about, in terms of those vaccinated, less than 1% of the country's population. Clearly the worst numbers in the region. And the country's Academy of Medicine, which is an independent organization, said just yesterday that at this pace, it could take upwards of a decade to vaccinate Venezuela. This is to say nothing of the Maduro regime's criminal use of the so-called Carnet de la Patria, or the fatherland card, which is a Chinese exported tool of social and political control, conceived of and built by ZTE Technologies. Vaccination through the fatherland card only has established vaccination as a tool for rewarding political loyalists of the regime and punishing the opposition, to say nothing of the fact that it's in distinct contravention of any sort of sound epidemiological advice. Now, the current government refuses to release public health data. Its last public report was released in 2017, and the stats compiled by independent organizations, which are far more reliable, are pretty dire. The UN estimates that somewhere near 94% of Venezuelans live in poverty. This is a multidimensional poverty study. 1/3 struggle to put enough food on the table, and in the year 2017, the average Venezuelan person lost about 11 kilograms. So we're risking here an entire generation of permanently stunted people because a criminal regime does not feel the need to take care of the population. Now, there are predatory criminal groups that operate within the country, militias in both urban and in rural areas frequented by Venezuelan migrants. Criminal groups exploit young men, they forcibly conscript them. Vulnerable young women are occasionally forced into the sex work industry. Displaced persons often arrive in Colombia and other parts of the region without documentation necessary to gain official status in Colombia. And for most Venezuelans, the complicated labyrinthian bureaucracy that exists in the country, as well as the bribes necessary to obtain a passport, make doing so really unthinkable and impossible. And so that's the scene setter here. Now, what has the US done to combat the criminal regime running Venezuela? Well, under the previous administration of President Donald Trump, the US embarked on a very wide-ranging campaign to place political pressure on the Maduro regime. The administration used sanctions, they used criminal indictments of suspected narco traffickers, and they used the very powerful tool of diplomatic recognition, namely that of interim President Juan Guaido, among other tools, to bring pressure on the Maduro regime. And the Trump administration hoped that by cutting off the regime's sources of illicit finance, as well as beefing up that diplomatic support for Juan Guaido, that it would reduce the Maduro regime's ability to survive, eventually leading to some sort of negotiated political transition, or at least a path to freer and fairer elections. And so far, the Biden administration seems to be following a similar logic, with repeated assurances throughout their little more than 100 days now, that the administration has declined to adumbrate a new policy or even to mention any sort of revisions. So one gets the sense that, at least for now, the previous administration's Venezuela policy is in place in the current US administration. Now, what has the European Union done to combat the criminal regime which is running Venezuela? Now, this is far more problematic. And this is the subject of the report, and why Jorge and I felt like it was so necessary to write this report. We were looking at this and wondering why it is that Europe has shown such a reluctance to act decisively against the Maduro regime. The bloc's posture toward Latin America, we found, has been largely designated or farmed out to Spain and its diplomats, which has not produced necessarily good results. Sanctions and other tools of pressure akin to the toolkit that the United States has employed have been applied only reluctantly and in rather small batches. So in two separate rounds, the EU added individuals to its sanctions list, two occasions in 2018 and another round in 19, as well as some more recent cases in 2020 and very recent cases in February of 2021, responding to fraudulent elections in December of 2020. These have only been sanctions against individuals. I think that's important to note. The EU has not sanctioned entities or companies, as the United States and other powers using these kinds of diplomatic tools have done. And in total, the bloc has about 55 total sanctions on individuals. Now, compare that to about 113 sanctions for a country like Canada, and well over 200 for a country like the United States. But there have also been major enforcement issues as well. Not only does Europe continue to represent a top destination for Venezuela's lucrative money laundering schemes, but it also represents a challenge for a common sanctions enforcement policy. We saw this most famously, I think, in the case of Delcy Rodriguez, the sanctioned vice president of Venezuela, when she was allowed to land at Madrid Barajas airport, receiving even a visit from the Spanish Minister of Transportation, if memory serves. So European policy, in the eyes, in my opinion, and I think in Jorge's as well, has been adrift and can do much better. Now, there's one area of potential praise that we think stands out, and that is, despite the fact that the Maduro regime remains very obstinate on the issue of humanitarian aid, the EU's vast sums of assistance, nearly 200 million euros since 2018, have gone a long way. They've markedly alleviated the plight of Venezuelans trapped in the country, as well as helped countries in the region that are receiving flows of migrants that are overwhelming their capabilities on the ground level. Now, lastly, I want to close by saying that I want to comment briefly on why it's important for the European Union to do more in this particular moment. And I think that too often the European Union in the previous US administration, that is the Trump administration, the European Union confused disagreements with the Trump administration on other issues, be they NATO Article 5, levels of defense spending that would be considered acceptable, the Iran nuclear deal. They confuse those disagreements with disagreements over the question of Venezuela. But I think we should be clear, and I hope that the report makes clear, that the European Union really does have the same interest in Venezuela as does the United States, as does the Venezuelan public. Free and fair elections and a return to democracy in the country. There really shouldn't be any differences between the US and the EU on this matter of national interest. Now, the nature of the tools that we're discussing in this report being used as pressure points against the Maduro regime require a broad-based consensual approach, a multilateral approach. And quite simply, without the European Union's cooperation on Venezuela, there won't be any solution in the short to medium term. The US has had to reckon with the hard limits of its sanctions policy as a tool to respond to human rights abusers, the authoritarian regime in Caracas, and the international security threats that it represents. The age of globalization in which we live has made these tools a potent weapon, but it has also allowed regimes like the one in Venezuela to mitigate this important source of leverage. And so quite simply, without the EU's help and cooperation on Venezuela, I don't see a solution in the short to medium term. However, if the EU and the US were to get on the same page, and this is the real crux of the report, the combined financial and diplomatic power of the two powers and their long history of joint diplomatic efforts make the idea of greater coordination on Venezuela policy an attractive alternative to the existing approach, which I see more as a parallel and unilateral approach to Venezuela. Existing efforts have led to a patchwork of policies that the Maduro regime has exploited very deftly. Multilateral sanctions campaigns are quite simply more effective, studying them from a historical context in achieving their stated aims than unilateral ones are. And this is significant in sort of the formula of making sanctions and sanctions campaigns part of a politics of leverage against rogue regimes like the one in Caracas. So if you look at all of the historical cases that we mentioned very briefly in the report, such as sanctions placed on apartheid-era South Africa or Gaddafi's Libya, those remain the sort of archetypal cases for the success of a multilateral sanctions campaign in achieving broad aims and contributing to political transitions in difficult countries. But without that more robust EU role here, I think that US policy has reached in many important ways its limits, as we've seen in the last year or so, with an incredible amount of pressure, unilaterally speaking, from the United States perspective, but still no movement in Caracas in terms of a movement towards a political transition. So I look forward to the comments, the question and answer session of this great event, and I'll stop there and turn it over to Jorge to describe the security threat represented by the regime in Caracas.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you, folks across the Western Hemisphere and the wider world. We're really thankful to the Fundación Internacional para la Libertad for gathering us today, and thank you particularly to Vanessa, to Edgardo, and to Marcel for being with us today and being fully aware of what an important issue this is for all of us, and how close to our hearts, all of our hearts, Venezuela remains, and we do remain hopeful that a solution of the current stalemate is possible. And as Ryan said, and thank you, Ryan, for setting the tables so nicely as always, and being so on top of the latest developments and the criminality front and the latest criminal activity coming out of Caracas. But I will focus, as Ryan said, on the security threat that this regime poses for the European continent, which we believe has been consistently underestimated and overlooked in service of a framework a framework to approach the Venezuelan situation that we think is fundamentally flawed. We think it is myopic. It signals weakness. It does not serve Europe's strategic interests, and ultimately it is based on a set of quite simply erroneous diagnostics. So I'll begin, and I think this is a really important place to start at. Is by asking ourselves with the question of what this framework is, right? What people in Brussels think when they see developments happening in Venezuela. And I think the overarching framework that drives the policies of the Josep Borrell diplomatic corps at this point is a framework that we could describe as a conflict resolution framework, right? It's the framework that sees a domestic conflict unfolding in Venezuela between the regime and the opposition, a conflict on which Europe must remain on the side of peace and thus must limit its strategic role in the conflict to mediation and to acting as a mediator in between those two conflicted sides. And our report, as Ryan outlined, really goes to really detail the core flaws of this framework. And first of all, Ryan has already said his piece about this. Venezuela is not your average domestic conflict. This is not a conflict over the meaning of the Venezuelan constitution. It's certainly not a political conflict on between two sides that we could equate in terms of their power, their ability to shape events. But most importantly, and where I really want to complete Ryan's expose is on the second half of Europe's posture, on this idea that all that Europe can do is just to be a mediator. I think the best way to approach this question I've realized over recent weeks isn't necessarily to rehash the old narrative of Civismo being a deliberate effort to conquer the Venezuelan state and to shape the Venezuelan state along ideological lines, as true as I believe that narrative still is. I think that that narrative tends to reduce the conflict to a war of narratives, right? It's ideological, and I think one thing that we've realized certainly in Spain, Ryan, with Ryan is that a lot of the groups and the voices that are being raised against Europe's quite frankly weak posture are kind of caught in this narrow framework of arguing against Chavismo on ideological grounds. And I think we got to widen the lens and really look at the broader set of threats that are being posed to Europe. And in doing so, I think we have to focus on specific issues on which this feeble and weak posture is crystallized, right? And one of them, and we do this in the report, one of them is the issue of electoral observation missions, right? These matter a lot to European diplomats, right? Europe has built over the years a specific, expertise in brokering, contested elections and having a sort of a specialism of how to run free and fair elections. And the diplomacy in Brussels at this juncture remains tethered to the idea that no matter how much Maduro's present grip on events may depend on past electoral fraud and past electoral shenanigans, the solution is always going to be the preferable solution is always going to be an electoral outcome to this conflict, right? A set of free and fair elections that delivers a win for the opposition. And we may agree or disagree on whether that is preferable, but most worryingly, what European diplomats still believe is that this outcome is possible. And that's where I think all of the flaws of this framework begin to multiply. And we've seen that this is really not a possible outcome under current circumstances, right? and this is where we have to sort of, as Ryan has already alluded to trace the history of Civismo, right? As in, Civismo has always been staked on, reforming the state along ideological lines, right? It goes all the way back to the Constitution of 1999, but even over the 20 decades the 2 decades that it's been in power, it has deliberately placed cronies and people friendly to the regime, to the ideology in key positions within the Venezuelan state. And we have to go back and look at the 2015 and the 2017 crisis, right? The parliamentary race that took place in 2015 that delivered a stonking win for the opposition, and after which the outgoing National Assembly, that was a majority regime legislature, created a parallel legislature to maintain a grip on legislative activity. And then a couple of years after that, the constitutional crisis that unfolded in 2017 when the Tribunal Supremo, the Supreme Court, appropriated the last few remaining powers that were left to the National Assembly by the National Assembly, and scrapped the immunity of the MPs of the National Assembly, which has allowed really unprecedented levels of persecution and even imprisonment. So when you understand that this regime has been consistently using power grabs and ways to appropriate the Venezuelan constitution, that's when the position of the EU as a mediator begins to look particularly flawed. The EU, still considers the deep divisions within Venezuela to be primarily political conflict that can be solved at the polls, if only a range of international actors, itself at the helm, can be made to mediate between the regime and the opposition, so that both can agree to have free and fair elections. And again, let's not look at to what extent the past proves this vision wrong, and just focus on what happens when the EU acts on this posture and the negative consequences that go with it. When there was another parliamentary race in December last year, it was a race that I think the entire world, and certainly a majority of the international community, knew was going to be fraudulent ahead of time. It was a race where the National Electoral Council had been previously packed by the regime-friendly Supreme Tribunal, the Supreme Court, and then this race also enlarged the legislature in a way that reeked of electoral fraud, right? So all the parties, all the key international actors, the United States certainly, but also the EU for a while, and the International Contact Group, the Lima Group, were very lucid in their view that this was not a race that the opposition should partake in, right? However, for a while there was some hesitation, also, and members of the opposition, seemed to project hesitation, and then European diplomats started to seem to signal that there was a mediation that could take place so that the opposition could finally agree to partake in the elections. And what we saw happen when the EU offered to send a mission of electoral observation was that the regime at that point said, we will agree to have international observers as long as they don't denounce the massive electoral fraud that happens in the country. And that's when you realize that this whole framework is flawed, right? There's no room for compromise with Maduro's National Electoral Council, and he will not grant the opposition the free and fair elections that the EU still hopes are possible. And yet, despite the repeated failure of this framework, we see these mediation frameworks proliferate. We see them retain some popularity in Brussels and other parts of the world. They still have some popularity among parts of the democracy promotion complex, and on both sides of the Atlantic. We've seen the EU already offer to play a similar role as a mediator ahead of the local and gubernatorial races that will take place in November this year. Ultimately what we argue in the report, and this is where I want to tie this back into the issue of the security threat that this regime poses to the EU. Ultimately, our view is that conflict resolution and mediation isn't the right way to go about this conflict. A look at the history of the regime and its behavior shows you that this is not a regime that will cede power, and will agree to hold free and fair elections. And ultimately, we think it is in Europe's interest to leverage its posture to help deliver a democratic transition in the country through closer alignment with the United States and the Biden administration. And the ultimate reason why we think this is in Europe's interest is because, again, and this all ties my expose pretty nicely, is I think it poses a huge threat to the EU itself. And this is the threat that has been consistently underestimated and consistently overlooked. In the report, we go over a few of the aspects of this threat, right? We discuss at length terrorism and the way in which the Venezuelan state has been embedded with criminality and embedded with terrorist actors, be they Colombian or Iranian, or Hezbollah, and even others. But we also argue that one of the threats that has been consistently overlooked by European diplomats is that the regime uses the euro and the eurozone to launder money into the safety of the European market, right? And they do this. We kind of documented length a lot of the specific cases where we've seen this play out, but it does this through what popular parlance calls bolichicos, through people who are closely associated to the regime, who have been systematically looting the country's oil giant, PDVSA, and who take away their gains, these cronies, and they park them. They go through they buy properties, right, in parts of the EU, primarily Spain, and then this allows them. They use Spain as a way station that allows them to park their gains ultimately in tax havens, right? So we argue in the report there's the security threat that we document allows us to make a few policy recommendations in terms of the sanctions that we think the EU should implement to deal with the security threat the regime represents, and ultimately, and this is where I really want to end. And Marcel, I'm really thankful that you made this very pertinent to the current news cycle, and even the news cycle that we're seeing in Europe, where if you follow the strategic debates going on in Brussels, there's a lot of talk of this idea of strategic autonomy, the idea that Europe needs to carve out a role for itself on the world stage, so as to project a strength on the basis of interests that it defines for itself, right? And we think that the crisis that is unfolding in Venezuela and the tyrannical nature of the regime is one such opportunity to assert through sanctions and through a stronger form of diplomacy, to assert that Europe means what it says, and that our commitment to a prosperous and a free Western Hemisphere and a prosperous and a free Latin America has real teeth, and that when it comes to these abuses, we're able to leverage power to make them stop. So with that, I will turn over to our guests, and thank you again all so much for being with us.
Well, thank you very much, Brian and Jorge. We now are open to questions from the public. Well, while we'll get the questions, let me suggest a theme. If we look at what has happened in the last 20 years in Latin America, and particularly in Venezuela, what we see is a permanent, how would I say, there is a sympathy between the Socialist Party in Spain and the Chavez regime. And this has been evident if we look at facts, not. And the problem is that in Venezuela, most political parties, almost all political parties with one single exception, call themselves socialist. So they want to be in good terms with the Socialist Party in Spain. But the Socialist Party in Spain wants to be in good terms with the Chavista regime. So that's one of the contradictions we see. I remember one of the most illustrious ambassadors Spain had in Venezuela seemed to be more interested in doing deals with PDVSA than in doing his job as ambassador. And he was a very eminent person by all standards. So it came as a big surprise. I mean, how powerful PDVSA is that they can tempt someone with their business. So that's one problem I see in the relationship. The other one is I see that particularly in the case of Spain, there seems, and with the socialist regimes, there seems to be a much friendlier attitude to populist governments than to democratic governments. That is the case you can see now in Mexico, in Argentina, in Venezuela, of course, but you can see it also in countries like Colombia, which is in deep trouble right now. So what can you tell us about that? What did you find about that?
Sure. I guess I'll take Marcel's first question and then turn over to Ryan and hoping for some broader discussion about some of the issues you bring up, Marcel, which are really relevant at the present time, particularly around Colombia. But yes, absolutely. One of the things we do highlight in the report is both the long record of collusion that we've seen happen between the regime and some actors that you rightly, in Spain, that you rightly identify on the left of the political spectrum. And we really are concerned that the regime has had a lot of political influence in the political spectrum in Europe at large. I mean, we know, and we've known for decades, that the Bolivarian narrative has been romanticized by European audiences. And I do think that this has found a particular hotspot in Spain, and we are very concerned by this. But more than that, I think the thing that we are primarily concerned about is the fact that this continues, even though this continues to this day, even though you know, I would argue most of the centrist political forces across the European continent have come around to seeing you know, a particularly unsavory nature in Maduro's regime. But what continues is the underestimation of the threat, right? You know, just as you were mentioning a second ago, the case of the ambassadorial presence of Spain and Caracas, and how that played into the links and the liaisons. You know, to this day, we're still seeing people within, again, as you mentioned, the center left political family in Spain and Europe at large. You know, open a friendly hand to the regime. We saw that play out with Delphigate, which I think was a case of myopia and quite frankly of naivete. So I think what we're particularly concerned is that it still continues under new forms, right? You no longer see in Madrid or even in other capitals in Europe this romanticized this romanticization of the Bolivarian narrative. I think people have grown past that, but you still see this play out in other realms, and that's what we're particularly concerned about.
I think we have a question from someone in the public.
Marcel, can I just comment on the Spanish element to this? Because I think one of the important parts of the report is one of the important conclusions, and one of the important parts is showing that you know, allowing for Spanish dominance of EU-wide policy toward Latin America is very limiting, and in very important ways limiting, and hasn't necessarily yielded the best policies, as it shouldn't when you have one country of a 27-member bloc, dominating policy toward a very large and diverse region. I think it's important to note that it's only natural that Spain feels a particular importance in these matters, just as France probably feels the same towards certain regions of Africa, for example, former colonies, just as the UK also feels the same towards its. And these meetings between Spain and many countries in Latin America have obviously been institutionalized through Ibero-American summits, at which Venezuela was present most recently, about a month and a half ago, represented by its Vice President the aforementioned Delcy Rodriguez. So these ties are very deep, and that's natural. But part of the report is to show that it hasn't yielded the best results. And the flip side of that coin is, of course, to argue that the more we can broaden the aperture here, the more we can drive up the interest in Venezuela throughout the EU bloc, I think it might actually contribute to better policymaking, because there will be more voices present in the policymaking discussion than simply the Spanish voice and what the Spanish interest is in a particular country of great importance, great strategic importance, like Venezuela. So the more we can bring in diverse voices, I think the more reason we might be able to have in this matter. And that's sort of the flip side of one of the important things that we're trying to show in the report with the Spanish dominance of EU policy toward Latin America.
Let's see if we have some questions from the public. I think I saw one. I think I have a problem with the questions because I can't see them in my screen. While we get the questions, let me ask you another question. You insist a lot on the drug traffic problem and the criminality problem. But if you look at TV and other media, most successful programs in Spain and Latin America, narconovelas come up very highly. I mean, there has been very few programs as successful as La Reina del Sur, for example, or Fariña. And there is another one, I can't remember the name, that happens in Galicia too. Isn't there perhaps some sort of part of the forms of protest against the governments is the idealization of gangsters, such as the people in Reina del Sur or Fariña, or criminals, and that's part of the protest against governments, because we see that democracy in Latin America, in particularly, and is on the way down. I mean, democracy was very successful up until 2000, I would say. And first, in the second half of the 20th century, beginning with Venezuela, Latin America started turning towards democracy, and democracy is very successful. And in the 80s, then the market economy became also popular in Latin America. But after the signature of the treaty in 2001, 2002, I don't remember when, we see a turn towards more populist and dictatorial kinds of government. Perhaps one way of protesting is the enhancement of these gangsters as the prototype of the hero.
Yeah, and I think there's a very key policy implication to what you described, Marcel, you know, I think, by the way, again, this is a very newsy hook you bring to the conversation. We're seeing with the COVID pandemic how the failures of the healthcare system to cope with the ravages of the pandemic are creating this massive vacuum for transnational organized crime to assert a grip on you know, citizens' lives, and we've seen this play out across many countries of the hemisphere. And in the particular case of Venezuela, I think the issue of narco trafficking that you bring up has been also a dead angle. Just one consequence of this regime that European diplomats have just not waken up to, right? They just don't seem to account for the fact that this regime in Caracas is deeply embedded with transnational crime and with drug traffickers, right, at a very big scale, and they haven't yet included. And when you look at the sanctions that the EU has deployed against the very paltry number that Ryan gave just a while ago, none of them have been specifically singled out for their activity in narco trafficking, whereas in the past administration in Washington, the Department of Justice made a very deliberate point of going after narco traffickers and the leaders of what we've come to know as el cartel de los soles. And as you rightly mentioned, Marcel, I think nothing of the sort is yet happening in Europe, even as we've got European data that shows the extent to which the drug routes that for a long time have linked production, production points in Latin America, Colombia, Ecuador, to the European consumer. These routes are being realigned through Venezuela. Venezuela is playing a growing role in the global cocaine trade, whether that is as an enabler of the trafficking, right? There's a legal vacuum that these criminals seize upon, but there's also an active role that the Venezuelan state is increasingly playing through El Cartel de los Soles and through the financial gains that it reaps from having a lot of cocaine trade flow through its territory. So I couldn't agree more with your point, Marcel. I think this is the issue of narco trafficking is, and Ryan has dedicated so much of his career to analyzing this particular case and within sort of the broad spectrum of criminal activity that happens in Venezuela. But on the particular case of narco trafficking, I do hope that someday someone in Brussels will wake up to the threat, because these drugs they're not just flowing across the hemisphere, right, north towards the United States. They're also taking the transatlantic route. So we document a lot of recent drug seizures in Spain. And again, I really appreciate the question, because we are not seeing European diplomats even realize what a massive threat this is to rule of law within the country, within Europe.
Let me just say on top of what Jorge said, to throw a little bit of data out there on narco trafficking with respect to Venezuela. Venezuela is the #1 point of embarkation for specifically for cocaine heading in the direction of Europe. And this is a simple market decision. The cocaine market in the United States, which mostly traces its origins to Colombian coca, which is obviously easily ferried through Venezuela and embarks through Venezuelan points of embarkation. This is a very saturated market in the United States. It's a very competitive market. But if, on the other hand, you can get cocaine into the European market, there's less competition, but there's also something like a 4- or 5-fold increase in the value of a kilo of cocaine. And so this is a simple response, I think, to prices and price fluctuations in an illicit economy. As you would expect any sort of rational actors in an illicit or illicit economy to be behaving, that there's a price incentive here, and actors are responding to the price incentive. And so over the last couple of years, we've seen Venezuela become a very prominent point of embarkation for drug flights, actually heading out over the Atlantic. There are still a significant number of flights that go over the Caribbean and land somewhere in Central America, where they will be ferried by land up to the United States eventually, but there are a significant number of flights as well going in the other direction. And that's, I think, what Jorge is referring to when he says that this threat has been significantly underappreciated in terms of some of the domestic implications that it has. Now, we can be skeptical about the ability to use drug trafficking as a weapon or as a tool of offensive state policy, but at least that was the intent going back to the Hugo Chavez regime, the former spy chief who goes by the nickname El Pollo, who happens to be in Spain at present, is quoted in a federal indictment, basically saying that he's the creator of this idea that Venezuela would become an exporter of drugs with state permission and state complicity as a sort of offensive weapon against the enemies of the Venezuelan regime. So we can be skeptical about whether or not that actually worked, but at the very least, it was the intent of the Venezuelan regime going back to the days of Hugo Chavez.
I have to apologize because I don't know how to get the question, so I'm going to ask another one to see if meanwhile I get the questions from the public. If you look at the relationship between Spain and Venezuela, let's be particular about that, Spain and Venezuela. During the Franco regime, two facts stand out. First is the fact that during Franco's regime, hundreds of thousands of Spaniards left Spain because of poverty and lack of opportunities and hunger to go to Venezuela. And I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people who made their life in Venezuela. While in Venezuela, and this was very convenient for the Franco regime, they sent billions of dollars in remittances from Venezuela. So that's one fact. The other fact I want to point out is that Franco was one of the very few leaders in the world who had a very good relationship with Fidel Castro. People say it is because they were both originally from the Coruña, and I mean, those ties and this and that, whatever. But the fact is that the relationship between Castro and Franco was excellent. Now if we look at the situation in Spain, we find that, and particularly the socialists, have a hatred for everything that Franco means. And they remove his name from streets, they take out his famous Paso de Meirás, and they are fighting Franco all the way. They disinterred him from the Valle de los Caídos, and yet his relationship with Castro has been untouched. I mean, that's one thing from Franco that the socialists respect. I mean, he did right. He did wrong everywhere, in everything he touched. But regarding Castro, he was right. Coming back to my point, regarding the Spaniards who left for Venezuela, the solidarity of the socialist regime with those people has been lacking. I mean, you don't see it, and you see, I mean, now those hundreds of thousands of people have multiplied into millions, because I mean, we're talking about 70 years. And yet there is very little they do to help those people out, and to help those people out of their miseries. I mean, their businesses have been expropriated, their families have been disseminated all over the world. Some of them have gone to prison, have left all their properties, have no country to go to. So how do you explain that? I ask this because I think there is an ideological relationship that is counting more than anything else.
Sure, and I'll be glad to take this one first. If that's okay with Ryan. I think I think, as you mentioned, one of the more despairing developments as we've seen the EU mishandle the Venezuelan situation in so many different ways is the particular role played by Spain, right, and the diplomats that it has appointed to key positions in Brussels as part of the European diplomatic corps, and also to the extent that Spain's national diplomacy also projects a certain posture, the extent to which the current government in Spain has also had its fair share of errors and quite frankly of myopic assessments of how the situation is unfolding in the country. And I think you know, I'm very sensitive to the migration aspect of the issue you bring up, Marcel. You know, we're already seeing that the Venezuelan citizens of European descent that you mentioned emigrated in such massive numbers over the 50s, 60s, and helped and really became a part of Venezuela's economic and democratic success, for which the country was so widely known across the world. These people are now the kids and grandkids of these people are now, or at least part of them, claiming their European lineage, and that is allowing a part of them to find refuge in Europe. And if we focus particularly on the migration issue, one of the things that really strikes me is, even absent any policy action of the kind that we recommend in the report, which is, for instance, granting the equivalent of TPS in Europe to Venezuelan refugees, even absent that kind of policy action, the links that you mentioned in terms of the migration that took place over several decades from Spain to Latin America, and particularly Venezuela, those links were already helping relocate a lot of the victims of this regime onto Europe. And that is something that Europe should be commended. Europe has also, to be absolutely fair with some of the efforts of the past couple of years, has also played a quite important role in assisting Venezuelan refugees along the Colombian border, in Colombia, in other countries of the region. Should it do more? We certainly believe it should, but it's already been playing quite a substantive role in palliating and some of the migratory consequences of the crisis. But as you mentioned, this is there's a lot more that Europe should be doing to help Venezuelan refugees. One of the recommendations we make is to look at ways that we could replicate the TPS system. This is a system that is very successful in the US, that has helped grant refuge to refugees from other similarly left-wing regimes across the hemisphere, be they Cuba, Nicaragua. And we think that a similar system could also signal that Europe stands with Venezuelan refugees, and we certainly hope that it will happen.
Marcel, were you waiting for me to make a comment? I have very
Yes,
little to add on to what Jorge said very eloquently about the links between Venezuelans and the EU, particularly as a recipient country. While it was the erstwhile wealthiest country in the region, it was the recipient of a lot of European migration, and now we see those migratory movements going back in the other direction. And so we're reminded of how history occasionally the pendulum swings back and forth, but in terms of the laudable actions that the EU has engaged in with respect to the humanitarian angle to this, I really don't have anything to add beyond what Jorge has already said, because I think this is one of the better parts of EU policy, has been the monetary support that the EU has been willing to put behind humanitarian efforts. Our issue is more with the framework, which seems to be brought to the situation in a moment that is not at all diplomatically ripe for negotiations and for some sort of political transition through the electoral mechanism. That's not to say that it never will be, but at this point in time, it's just so far from being the reality that the real danger here is actually cementing or further entrenching the regime in Caracas with a critical mistake or two, to the point where we see them and their resilience extended for a number of years because of a very costly action undertaken through this mistaken framework.
In terms of real politics, one of the problems we see is that neither the US nor Europe consider the problems of Latin America to be a threat to them. Not, and more so of Venezuela, which is a tiny part of Latin America. But if you look at their intelligence reports, you will find that in the last 10 or 20 years, we never appear among the most important threats to either the US or Europe. Why is it that the US and Europe do not consider Latin America to be a threat, instead, in spite of all the problems that you mentioned in your report? Where have we failed in making our point?
Well, if Jorge doesn't mind, I'll grab that question first, because it feels very relevant to the course that I just wrapped up for my students. You mentioned in the introduction that I'm also an adjunct member of the Catholic University faculty, and I teach Latin American politics for CUA students. And one of the first classes that we have is actually titled The Latin American Paradox. And the paradox resides in the fact that Latin America is perhaps the region of the world that's most integral and most important to US security, and yet we underinvest on a systematic level year in and year out, decade in and decade out, in understanding Latin America, in seizing opportunities in Latin America, in engaging in policy in Latin America that will help further the country's prosperity and consolidate its democracy. We miss out on opportunities, and we also miss potential threats because we underinvest systematically in the region. And it's really always been that way, or at least for a long time, it's been that way. And I think part of it has its roots in the fact that the US was historically dominant within its hemisphere, and was looking further afield as a place to, for further places to project its foreign policy influence. And there was a certain element to which the US kind of took Latin America for granted. Now, I think that's changing. I really do think that's changing in the last 5 or so years, especially with the rise of the expression great power competition, which was in the 2017 national security strategy of the Trump administration. It's something that I think the Biden administration has endorsed and has run with and made their own. And I think that there's a way in which the presence, the increasing presence of China, and to a lesser extent Russia, in the US shared neighborhood, which is to say Latin America and the Caribbean, has caused the US and the policymaking community to focus more attention. I don't know if it's enough to completely surmount the Latin American paradox, but it's certainly a welcome start. And I think we'll see that paradigm shift probably completed in the next 5 years or so, as we continue to see China and to a lesser extent Russia and Iran ramp up their presence in the hemisphere, not just through Venezuela, by the way, but really region-wide. And in terms of Europe, I'll let Jorge answer in a more complete manner, but I think that if I had to venture a guess, Latin America just felt a little far. It just felt a little bit, further from a region of priority than did, say, the Middle East or Africa, given the geographic, geostrategic location. But as the report mentions, in an era of globalization, where globalization has helped to increase interests in parts of the world that feel a little bit distant, or geographically indeed might be very distant nevertheless, has managed to increase national interests in places that are very far afield, and has also helped to either increase or decrease the efficacy of certain tools that we were talking about in the diplomatic toolkit. So it's wholly conceivable for the EU not only to have an interest in what happens in a faraway place like Latin America, to have a very keen national interest, in fact, but also to use its diplomatic weight for furthering the situation in a way that prior to globalization might have felt a little bit difficult. But I'll turn it over to Jorge maybe to round out and complete that answer.
Well, there's very little that I can add, even from Europe's standpoint. What is really striking to me, and I hope you agree, Marcel, is that if you go back to the early 2000s, as the Hugo Chavez playbook was kind of claiming its grip on events, and as the regime was launching this march towards building an authoritarian regime of the kind that we've seen it develop. I think the overarching consensus in Europe was that even as we could disagree with some of the rhetoric, the populist hard left, even quite frankly, socialist rhetoric coming out of Caracas, even if Europe found that unsavory, there was a lot of trade and migratory linkages that Europe ought to maintain, unsavory as though the regime was, in order to signal that it still believed in Venezuelan democracy. And I think that framework is also playing into how Europe sees Venezuela at the moment. I think it's not entirely over. So I really appreciate the question. In fact, because I think it helped us understand how this rather naive view that the Bolivarian alliance could shape policy in Latin America in a democratic fashion, because we believe that it had wide popular backing, and that there was nothing particularly authoritarian about Chavismo in the early days. That view has blinded us to the many reforms that were deployed in the early days of Chavez to build up the authoritarian nature of the regime, right? To hold a firm grip on the key institutions of state, to place cronies and people who are friendly to the regime in positions where they could then rewrite the Constitution, or even create parallel legislatures. So I think the reason why we've been blinded to the authoritarian course of the regime, is you can trace it back to the early 2000s, and I am in fact I do think that a lot of the priors ought to be revisited. And the unfortunate fact is that the people who are in charge in Brussels and in Spain at the moment in terms of diplomacy vis-a-vis Latin America, they don't seem to have gotten the memo that this regime was authoritarian in nature from the get-go. And when they realized that would really help shape EU policy towards a different kind of framework, one that isn't necessarily tethered to conflict resolution and to mediation, but one that is more willing to exert pressure to achieve a democratic transition.
Well, unfortunately, our time has run out. Thank you very much, Ryan. Thank you very much, Jorge, for this very important and very interesting paper. I hope we keep in touch and have the opportunity to talk more frequently about this important issue, because Venezuela right now is in a very difficult position. And I think both Europe and the US could be very helpful in helping us find a way out of the troubles we are into. Thank you very much to you, to the Fundación Internacional para la Libertad, and to Vanessa. And I hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcel, and thank you, Phil. Thank you, Vanessa, and thanks to all the folks who've tuned in.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you soon.
Hope so.